Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for more dedicated legacy action. Today we've got a bit of extra bonus content for you. With the new set Duskmourn House of Horror on the horizon, I thought it'd be a good idea to do one of my little set reviews where I pull out any cards I think might be legacy playable. Now, caveat here, I don't think that all 20 of these cards are going to be seeing regular play in legacy, but I'm just looking at some of the things that might be interesting, people might be building around them, and so on and so forth. But there are definitely a few cards from this set that are definitely going to make a splash one way or the other. So without further ado, let's jump right in. First up we have Veteran Survivor. A 1-mana 2-1, so it's a Savannah line. It's a human, which is a relevant creature type. There are human decks that see a little bit of fringe play in legacy. And it has a useful ability of exiling cards from the graveyard. That is something you definitely want to be able to do. This also encourages vehicles or convoke and stuff like that to make sure that you can get the ability the turn you play it. But just being able to exile cards from graveyard is not a bad thing to have on a 2-1 these days. Also, the ability at the end where if you have 3 cards exiled with it or more, it becomes a 5/4 hexproof. That is quite the rate for a 1-mana card, and you can get there. It takes a few turns to build up, but I think this might see a little bit of fringe play in some of the human decks. Now, are those decks good in legacy? That is a different question. I'll let you answer that one yourselves. Next up, we have one of these split card rooms. So this is Polluted Cistern or Dim Oubliette. So the front side, as I say the front side, the left side is 1 and a black. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, each opponent loses 1 life for each card among those types. So let's say you dredge your life from below and you have this in play. You can just hit your opponent for like 2-ish life for doing something you're doing anyway. Now there are decks like Hogak, which mill yourself in little chunks, and this could be something you could use in those decks. Helps you get through things like Ensnaring Bridge, although you might just be using Altar of Dementia instead. But this is an interesting effect. The other side of the room is a 5-mana. When you unlock this door, mill 3 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Again, if you're milling yourself, you're probably going to want these effects to be able to pull some stuff when you've got some mana going. For those who are unfamiliar with how these room cards work, you pay for either half, and then you play that half, and once it's in play, you can pay the cost on the other half to pay the other half. So this is probably going to be coming down as a 2-drop, and then later on you can put 5 mana into it, and then you get the extra effect. So that is basically how the rooms work. I think this card might have some niche applications that could be interesting. I think there's a lot of fun stuff with milling your own deck, and we'll see some more of that in this spoiler, I'm sure. Next up, here's some more milling. This is Hedge Shredder. So this is whenever Hedge Shredder attacks, you may mill 2 cards. That's not the exciting part of this card. The exciting part is whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped. So let's say you had something like a Hedron Crab, and you played a land, and you milled yourself, and then there was a land that you milled. You would put that into play, which would then trigger your Hedron Crab, which would then mill you some more. So you can use that as a sort of weird Cephalid Breakfast style combo to mill your entire deck. Now, is that necessarily what we want to be doing? Paying 4 mana for this artifact to do that? Probably not, but are you going to see some of the combo players in Legacy trying it out with their like meme builds? Certainly. I don't think it's going to be good enough, but I'm very curious to see how it looks and what people are doing with it. Next up, Balustrade Worm. This is a pretty big creature that's got some delirium, and there's quite a few delirium stuff in the new set that looks quite tasty to me. So this is a 5-mana 5/5, trample haste can't be countered. That's pretty reasonable. I think you can certainly see that we've had cards like this see a little bit of play before, like Thrund was one that we had once upon a time that people were running, and in some Nickfoot decks you do have some bigger creatures that people are trying to cast, but the other ability is really interesting. If you have delirium, you can pay 2 green to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter. A finality counter means next time it would die, it gets exiled instead. So this is just a card that comes back. It has haste. Seems pretty interesting to me. And you can mill it over, get some free value. Not too shabby. Next up, we have Wildfire Wickerfolk. This is another delirium creature, and the rate on this one is pretty darn good. If you were to tell me that this was the rate of creatures back in the day when I started playing, I would be amazed. This is only an uncommon as well. So it's red and a green for a 3/2 haste. That is the baseline on this card. And when you have delirium, it's +1/+1 and trample as well. So that's a pretty aggressive rate. Now, an aggressive deck like this wants a lot of aggressive creatures to attack with, which means it might be difficult to have enough creatures and enough delirium enabling cards, like your Mishra's Baubles and Lotus Petals or whatever. But that's certainly something to keep an eye on. Dragon's Rage Channeler being the best delirium creature thing that we had before this. I'm curious to see if there can be a delirium deck built. I've definitely written about this on my Patreon. Whether or not we can fine-tune the list to be good remains to be seen, but the rate on this is very strong. And it's also an artifact creature, so when it dies, it's 2 types for delirium for your future cards. Up, we have another Delirium adjacent card. This is Ursine Monstrosity. 2 and a green for a 3/3 trample. In a world where Lightning Bolt is incredibly low stocks right now in Legacy because it doesn't kill Psychic Frog, a 3/3 for 3 isn't the worst. Now, it has another ability which is very, very good here. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, you mill a card, and then you choose an opponent at random. So we're playing a 1v1 format, so it's always going to be your opponent, and then your creature has to attack them. But it's okay because it gets +1/+1 for each card type among cards in your graveyard, and indestructible. So they're not killing it when it's attacking, and it's going to be big, and it's going to trample. So if you've got Delirium, this is a 3-mana 7/7 trampler with indestructible. That is quite the rate on a creature like this. Now, the fact that it also mills you and tries to enable more Delirium is also really cool, and I think this card is quite strong. The question is it up to the standards of Legacy? I'm going to give it a go. I'm not entirely sure it's going to break through, but it's definitely like a sort of small engine plus a big beta, which is not a bad place to be. Next up, we have Fear of Isolation, an enchantment creature, Nightmare. 1 and a blue for a 2/3 flyer. As an additional cost to cast this spell, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. There is a card called Arctic Merfolk that sees play because it has a return a creature as a cost, as a kicker cost. This is just a better version of that card, basically. So this will get slot into Alluring, because if you're not doing Alluring things, this is obviously a lot better than a Arctic Merfolk. But yeah, it's just a slight upgrade for a card that already sees play in a sort of niche fringe deck. Next up, we have Unable to Scream. This is a common, and I think it might see some play in Legacy. At least I want to play it. It's a single blue mana for an aura. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a toy artifact creature with base power and toughness 0 and 2, in addition to its other types. As long as enchanted creature is face down, it can't be turned face up. So this is a 1 mana blue answer to a lot of creatures. Now, it's not going to be very good against Psychic Frog, because they put a load of counters on and it still has those counters. But the fact that things like Lightning Bolt aren't great right now, you can run some nice blue removal in this form. We've seen things like Pongify and stuff like that in the past. See some fringe play in like mono blue Delver decks. This just feels a lot better than quite a few of those cards. And I'm excited to play with this because I like to play weird decks sometimes like Blue-Red Splinter Twin. And this is a nice answer to some problem permanents. We've seen effects like this normally cost 2. So it costing 1 is pretty good to just be able to blank a creature. And people aren't really removing auras that often anyway. Next up, we have one of the impending creatures. There's a few impending creatures in the format that are being brought in. So impending is basically you pay it for the impending cost, and then it has counters on, and then when those counters tick down, it becomes a creature. So it kind of sits in place. It's like a weird pseudo-suspend in a lot of ways. But when it enters a battlefield or attacks, it gets an ability, and this is kind of standard for all the impending creatures. The reason I picked the black one to showcase rather than the others, because the black one has more ability to remove counters. So we have things like Vampire Hexmage, Mutated Cultist that can remove the counters from this if you wanted to. And milling your library is quite a nice thing to do as well here. And 2 mana for the impending cost is on the lower side of these. So that means it's more likely to see play in Legacy. But yeah, so this is a 2 mana. You mill 4 and return a non-avatar creature card or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. We see things like Mulch seeing some play in Legacy. Obviously that is a thing that can draw you multiple cards, but it's not entirely impossible to see stuff like that. You know, Impulse is a card that sees a little bit of play, and obviously once upon a time you are casting that for its regular cost sometimes. So it's kind of a bit like that, but also you get a big creature on the backside. And there's various things you can do. You know, you can flicker this, for example, with a Flicker Wisp, and then you just get a big creature, or you can remove the counters like I mentioned before. It's a permanent, so you can sacrifice it for whatever you need. So there are definitely some interesting things that you'd be able to do with this. Quite what it's going to do in the format, I'm not sure, but it's one to keep an eye on. Next up, we have Razorkin Needlehead. This is red 2/2, has first strike during your turn, so it wants to be attacking. And whenever an opponent draws a card, this deals 1 damage to them. So this isn't just the first, like after the first card. So it's not Bowmaster's text, it's just every card they draw will deal 1 damage. So it will be clocking them just from them their normal draw return. So we've seen Bowmasters obviously be very good. This is like a red Bowmasters, but we don't get to ping their creatures, which is definitely a lot worse. But if you're playing a deck like LED, Echo Vion style nonsense, you can then have multiple creatures that just allow you to win, so you don't have to try and get up to like shoulder banner before you do your wheeling. So playing this and then doing an Echo Vions is relatively doable. So I'm kind of interested to see how this one pans out. Is this going to make Burn good again in Legacy? Probably not, but it's not nothing. The Jolly Balloon Man is our next port of call. This is a 1 red and a white for a 1/4 haste human clown legendary creature. Quite the mouthful of different stuff there. But the ability is what's really interesting here. 1 tap, Create a token that's a copy of another target creature you control, except it's a 1/1 red balloon in addition to its other colors and types. It has flying and haste and sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. You can only activate as a sorcery, but we've seen how things like the backside of Fable and Mirrorbreaker, the reflection of Kiki Jiki, can really snowball and do some wild things. The fact that this has haste is kind of cool. We've certainly seen like painter decks splashing into white, and this being able to copy a Goblin Engineer is very strong, so maybe there is something to it there. But being a legend is obviously a downside because it means it gets bounced by Caracas. But the fact that it has haste, and then once you play it, you get priority, so you can just activate it straight away, means you're going to get an activation off before the Caracas gets to do its thing anyway. Could be an intriguing one. I can't work out exactly where I would want to play this over other things, but it's certainly an option. Next up, we have Kona Rescue Beastie. This is a 4-mana, 4/3 legendary creature. So again, we have the issue of it being legendary, but it has this survival mechanic, which is a recurring mechanic you see across the set. This is at the beginning of your second main phase. If it's tapped, you get to do something. So in the case of this one, we get to put a permanent card from our hand into play. So we get like a little bit of a eureka out of it. Now, this is very easy to make happen, because what you can do is just play something like a piece of equipment. Of calling, something like that. But I'm thinking the main one that I would like to play with this would be Smuggler's Copter, because Smuggler's Copter allows you to play this in the first main, activate your Smuggler's Copter, and then dig your way towards some big monsters. And maybe if you don't have this or have excess copies or things aren't going well for you, you can throw away your big creatures and just try and get some better, cards for their rate, so you can play the game of Magic the Gathering instead of trying to do your big splashy combo. So this card is going to see some people messing around with it, especially since lightning bolts aren't a big thing right now, so it's not just going to get bolted down for being a 4/3. Ancient Celespawn is a pretty weird card with a bit of a unique effect here. So this is a 1 black horror. It's a 3/3. Each spell you cast that's a demon, horror, or nightmare costs 1 less to cast. That's not really what we're interested in here. It's the other line of text. Whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast it was less than its mana value, target opponent loses life equal to the difference. So Evoke, or Delve, or pitch cast spells, Force of Will, or even Soul Spike if you want to port the Necrodominance deck from Modern into Legacy. Those are all options, and this can hit really hard. The question I have is, what does your deck do when you don't have this? And is that deck viable when you don't have this? If so, then you can build a deck that utilizes this. Like, free spells are good. You can even play like a aggressive red-black deck where your Fire Blast can suddenly become 10 damage instead of 4. And that would be pretty impressive too. So what you can do with this card is very high. It's an incredibly high ceiling. I am worried about the floor of this and the decks you put it in, but I would like to see some people messing around with it. Back on the Delirium train, we have Demonic Council. Simply put, this is Demonic Tutor when you have Delirium. If you don't have Delirium, it searches for a demon. So if there are some demons that are worth playing, you're probably going to see like 1 or 2 demons in some decks that would be running this maybe, just as a thing if that doesn't work out for them. I've heard some people saying that they want to run this over Infernal Tutor, which I could understand because getting Delirium is kind of easy, and if you've got a Lion's Eye Diamond to enable your Infernal Tutor, then things are probably going all right anyway, whereas this allows you to maybe go without your big pseudo Black Lotus and be able to do some things. I think Brian Cook was talking about this one and saying he's quite interested in seeing how it plays out. I am worried that it is a tutor that gets exposed very easily by Graveyard Hate. But what it could be is, instead of running it in a full-on combo deck, this could just be something in a bigger Delirium shell. So maybe instead of playing aggro, we play some of the bigger Delirium payoffs and play like a rock-style deck that's got access to a tutor. That could be good. But is it better than running Beseech the Mirror? Possibly, because of the mana cost is a lot easier to cast. But this one is definitely going to see some play somewhere. Whether or not it remains a card that sees playing, I don't know. But people are going to test it for sure. We have 2 cards that I'm counting as one. This is Alternac the Thrice Called, and say its name. This is a 9/9 legendary creature with trample. Whenever it's the target of spell or ability, you get to draw a card, and you can discard it from your hand to return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is just a big creature that comes with its own way of being cheated into play. So say its name is mill 3 cards, return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. So a bit like Mulch, a bit like a Once Upon a Time that you're paying mana for. It's fine, but not great. But you can exile 3 of them from your graveyard to search your hand, graveyard, or library for the big creature and put it straight into play. So I've seen people messing around with Intuition as a way of getting all of these cards, just so you can have your little self-contained combo of getting a 9/9. Now, is that the best thing you can do with an Intuition? My opinion of that is probably no, but running maybe 4 of these in a deck where you're milling yourself anyway might be a little bit better and just give you a little bit of reach. Like if you've got some sort of Hogak adjacent deck, maybe there's another big creature you can have in it because you've got this thing that's going to mill you, which is what you want to be doing in a deck anyway, and then you can kind of go from there. So people are definitely messing around. I've already seen a few deck lists popping up as well. So people are going to be playing this one. Whether or not it's good enough for Legacy will have to be borne out via time and people actually playing with it. But people are definitely testing it. And I'm excited to see a nice self-contained engine that can kind of get you a big creature on the board and start bashing. Also, it's an insect, so it does trigger off of Grist, which is another tiny little slice of value because Grist in these sorts of decks might be quite good too. Chainsaw. This is a new equipment that I think is going to see some play because it's 1 on a red. When it enters, it deals 3 damage to up to 1 target creature. That's a reasonable rate. People play stuff like that anyway. Whenever 1 or more creatures die, put a rev counter on it, and then the equipped creature gets +X+0, where X is the number of rev counters on Chainsaw. So we've seen painted decks run, I can't actually remember the name of that artifact now. There's a 2-mana artifact that comes in shocks and then does some other stuff. And painted decks have had that as a thing that they can tutor for. This just deals more damage, so it's probably going to be slightly better to tutor for with like your Goblin Engineer type thing. So I imagine this is going to be a one-of tutor target, which helps them clear the board and play a nice fair game where their little creatures, if they can't use their graveyard or whatever, like their welders aren't able to weld anything because there's no ley lines of the void, then you can just, gear up a chainsaw and start going. And this is whenever 1 or more creatures die. So it counts your own creatures as well as the one you kill straight up. Another room card for you here. This is Walk-in Closet. So this is a 3-mana enchantment Crucible. Now, if you know me, I'm a big fan of Crucible of Worlds. So this is just that on an enchantment, which is pretty cool. But the other side is also really good. So it's 5 mana. When you unlock this, you may cast spells from your graveyard this turn. If a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So it's Crucible of Worlds on one side and Yawgmoth's Will on the other. Okay, those are both good cards that both see, well, obviously Yawgmoth's Will doesn't see play in Legacy because it's banned, but it's, a card that's so good it's not allowed in Legacy. And then we have Walk-in Closet as the Crucible. We see a bit of fringe play with Crucible. This is also a green card, so it pitches things like Force of Vigor and Endurance, which could be really handy too. It sort of goes into the pantheon of cards like Ramunap Excavator and so on and so forth. So I think this will see some play. Now, this is a card I'm genuinely excited about and I think is really cool. This is 2 and a green sorcery. It's a kindred sorcery, so it's got 2 types, so it triggers Delirium a bit better. It's a shapeshifter, so it can be found with anything that's going to be tutoring creature types. So there's so many different ways of interacting with this already. Create an XX colorless shapeshifter creature token with Changeling and Death Touch, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard. So this is kind of like Worm Harvest, but you make 1 big guy instead of 1 little guy, instead of lots of little guys even, but it costs 3 instead of 5. And it has Retrace. I should probably mention the Retrace. That's important. So I think pretty much every Life from Alone deck is going to want to have a copy of this in it somewhere because it's just a phenomenal thing to be doing when you're just Life from Aloneing anyway. You just go, okay, I'm just going to make a big guy every turn until you lose. And I would be absolutely shocked if we didn't see this in a bunch of Legacy decks. Here is the card that a lot of people have been talking about. Metamorphosis Fanatic. This is a 6-mana 4/4 lifelink. When it enters, return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. Obviously, 6 mana, too expensive, not good enough for Legacy. But it has Miracle for 1 and a black. So you can get this down as early as turn 3 if you don't have any mana acceleration like Lotus Petals or whatever. So you can be, putting some stuff in your graveyard within tombs. We've seen how powerful reanimate strategies are in Legacy right now. This is something that can kind of work alongside that. The issue is this better than a reliable thing like an Animate Dead that can hit your opponent's graveyard as well? Probably not. So it maybe goes in a different deck. You could put several of these in your graveyard and bring 1 back, and then when you bring back another one of these, it brings back another one. You sort of like have a cascading chain. It's almost a bit like the Arclight Phoenix, I think it's called, the one where you get to play a bunch of spells and they jump back in your attack step. So you can kind of do a similar thing. Maybe we're going to see like a Buried Alive deck with this in. I know people are really hot on this card. I don't think it's quite as good as everyone's like immediately saying it was. Like think about Triumph of St. Catherine. That is a fine card. It's not overpowered. It's just a role player in Legacy that is okay. But people lost their minds when it came out and thought it was like the best thing ever. So I think people are overvaluating how powerful this is. It's where the ceiling is very high. The ceiling is the moon, basically. You can do whatever you want with this card. But the floor is not very high at all. The floor is just being a dead card, and you can't even pitch it to Grief because Grief's banned now. All right, I think we've got one more card left on my list. Ghost Vacuum. This is my pick for what I think is going to be one of the most played cards in Legacy from the new set. I don't think you're going to see a lot of it. I think what we are going to see is a very specific deck is going to want this. Free Strider Lookout is a card that's seeing Legacy play. It's 2 and a green, and whenever you commit a crime, you look at the top few cards of your library and put a land from those cards. It triggers once per turn. So that deck is already running Scrabbling Claws to try and, target your opponent where they remove a card of their choice. So this is just an upgrade from Scrabbling Claws for that deck, because you get to exile target card from a graveyard instead of your opponent's choice. And there is some other text where if you have 6 mana, you can put 1/1 copies of all the creatures you've exiled into play. And that's probably not going to come out that much. However, if you are pairing this with a Free Strider Lookout, you're going to be pulling out loads of land from your deck, right? Which means you're going to have 6 mana. So the actual 6 mana on this isn't flavor text. It's going to come up a lot more often than you would think. But this is just going to be an Urza Saga target for any Free Strider Lookout deck. And I think more green decks should be playing Free Strider Lookout. As I mentioned several times today, Lightning Bolt is very low in the format right now. And the value of Free Strider Lookout pumps out is really, really strong and has impressed me on both sides of the table whenever I've seen it. And Ghost Vacuum is just a better version of the thing they're already playing. So it's definitely going to see play as a replacement to that. So I can be pretty assured that this is going to see Legacy play. Cards that just replace other cards, not exactly a difficult guess though. And that brings us to the end of this little bonus content for you. I hope you enjoyed my little journey through Duskmourn, House of Horror, and sort of seeing some of the cards I'm interested in. I think will be fun to see what people come up with. If you've got any cards that you think I've missed, for example, I suspect some of you might think the 2 and a blue massive blue flyer guy, I think it's a 5/5 flyer, where you have to exile cards from your graveyard to play it, and then it manifests every turn. I know a lot of people are quite interested in that one. I quite like it with Satoru as a thing you can do, but I do think it is just worse than big flyers like Murktide, but that definitely could have had a place on the list. But I tried to pick some things that I thought were a bit more interesting and unusual as well, alongside the things that were, clear ones that people are already building around. So, please remember to like and subscribe. That way you won't miss any of my content with the new cards when they come to Magic Online. And thank you so much for watching. Goodbye. If you'd like to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon. It has a free guide to budget turbodepths as well as 3 tiers of support. A low cost one that enters you into my monthly raffle for a free donation deck on the channel, a mid-tier subscription that gives you access to my detailed turbodepths guide that is updated every month as well as regular articles, and lastly the higher tier gives you all of the above as well as a monthly donation deck for my channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel this way, please check out the link in the description.